Her cruel mother-in-law imprisoned her in the basement while she was pregnant, believing her husband, a Civil War soldier, had died. But he was alive, and no one knew until he came back. The wind moved like a hush over the open plains, soft as a mother's breath against the brow of a sleeping child. Evening sunlight draped itself over the land in golden ribbons, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods and breaking against the wooden bones of a house that had forgotten how to smile. This house stood alone, hunched and gray on the edge of nowhere, with a roof that sagged like a tired back and windows clouded by time. It did not welcome, nor did it threaten. It simply endured. Inside, quiet ruled. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that comes after something has broken and no one dares speak of it. The floorboards creaked under the slow, measured steps of Hester Langley, who moved like a ghost that still believed it owned the place. Her face was carved from stone and frost, not old exactly, but hardened by years that had worn her softer parts away. She held a teacup in hands that never shook, though they had buried more than one hope in the hard western soil. She moved through the parlor without glancing toward the cellar door. That door, which had once led to pickled peaches and salted pork, now led to silence, shadows, and secrets. It was locked. She always checked the lock before sleep. Tonight would be no different. Beneath the floor, where light came only through the thinnest cracks between the planks, Marian Langley sat curled like a fern in the cold dirt. She pressed a hand gently against her swollen belly, speaking not in words but in rhythm, a lullaby carried in the thump of her heart, slow and tired. Dust clung to her cheeks and her lips were cracked from air too dry and water too rare. She had been there long enough to stop counting. Days had melted into one another, like candle wax on a hot plate. Her thoughts came in flickers now, not lines. But she remembered. She remembered when the wind carried laughter through these walls. When Eli, her husband, had come home with arms that knew how to hold joy. He had been her stillness in a world that shouted. A soldier once, returned from the horror fields of the East, but never cruel, never hard. The telegram that announced his death had arrived with a government stamp and a stranger's apology. Marian had clutched it like it might burn through her palms. But it wasn't the paper that seared her, it was the silence that followed. That silence had given Hester all the room she needed. "You'll want a pack," the older woman had said, voice as crisp as snapped twigs. "Widow or not, it ain't right for you to be here alone. And with a child on the way, people will talk." Marian had blinked, slow and unsure. She had thought the land was hers now, hers and Eli's. She had thought wrong. "There's a place downstairs," Hester had added later. "Just for now. Safer, with the wind and all. You look so pale these days." She hadn't fought. Maybe she should have. But Marian was tired, not just in her bones, but in her spirit. Grief had made her pliable. And when the door closed behind her with the cold metallic clink of a key turning, it was too late for protest. Since then, the days had folded inward like dying petals. Hester brought her water in a tin bowl once every other day. Bread when she remembered. But mostly, there was the dust and the cold, and the low ache in Marian's back that reminded her time was nearing. She whispered stories to the baby sometimes. About fields of wheat taller than a man. About Eli's laugh. About the shape of clouds on a summer day. She spoke them like prayers, offerings to whatever spirit watched from beyond the wood and stone. She wanted her child to enter the world with hope, even if born into shadow. Once, she had cried. Just once, when she thought the baby stopped moving. But the faint flutter came back like a whisper, and she'd smiled in the dark. Above, Hester poured herself a cup of coffee and watched the sun bleed out behind the hills. She did not speak to Marian. She did not answer questions from the neighbors. She had told them that Marian left, ran off to find her sister out east. No one questioned her. Why would they? Hester had lived here for 30 years. Marian had barely lasted 3. Hester considered herself a woman of survival. She had buried her own daughter in a winter so cruel the ground refused to yield. She had watched a husband drink himself into rage, and later, into the grave. Hardship had taught her rules. Softness gets swallowed. And Marian, for all her kindness, was soft. Too soft to raise a child alone, too soft to protect the name Hester had spent decades upholding. The basement wasn't cruelty. It was mercy in her eyes. Mercy before scandal. Mercy before shame. But mercy never came in the form of chains. And walls, no matter how thick, couldn't stop truth from growing. Marian hadn't seen the stars in weeks, but she still felt them. She imagined them blinking like sleepy eyes far above her prison. Sometimes she reached toward the ceiling, fingertips brushing splinters, as if she might grasp the light if she reached long enough. Sometimes she dreamed of rivers and rain, of washing her face in cold mountain water. Other times, she dreamed of Eli, not the way he looked, but the way he made her feel. Safe, heard, whole. Once, she heard a voice above her. Not Hester. A girl's voice. Laughing. Skipping. She pressed her ear to the wood and listened. The girl was probably no older than 10 or 11. A neighbor, perhaps. For a moment, Marian thought to call out. But what if the girl told Hester? What if Hester stopped bringing bread? So she swallowed the hope like medicine and stayed silent. The house creaked as the wind picked up. Somewhere, a shutter slapped against siding. Marian closed her eyes. Her child kicked softly, as if reminding her, still here. She whispered again, this time with more conviction. Your papa used to hum when he didn't have words. I think that's where I learned it. There are things that live in sound, even if you don't know what they mean. The baby pressed back against her palm. I will get us out, she murmured. I don't know how, but I will. The night deepened. Above, Hester put out her lamp and settled into bed with a sigh like a closing door. The prairie wrapped the house in cold arms, and the stars blinked on, distant and silent. The wind carried no answers. But it carried Marian's vow. In the cellar, she shifted her weight and leaned against the wall. Her hand moved across the dirt beside her, searching until she found the charcoal stub she had saved. She began to draw on the stone, lines, loops, shapes of things remembered. A tree. A man's face. A bird mid-flight. The baby kicked again, a rhythm inside her, like a second heartbeat. Like company in the dark. She did not know that far off, beyond the blue hills, Eli Langley was very much alive. She did not know he'd buried comrades and stitched his own wounds and read every letter she'd ever sent 100 times until the pages tore. She did not know he'd been making his way home, one aching mile at a time. But some part of her, the same part that refused to give up, the part that kept drawing hope onto stone, believed he wasn't gone. Not really. That kind of love didn't vanish. It waited. It held on. And above her, unseen, a crack in the floorboard widened just enough to let in a sliver of starlight. It touched her cheek like a fingertip. She smiled. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a horse's hoof broke through the silence of morning. The house sat still, unbothered by the wind that rattled the shingles or the dust that rose like ghosts from the prairie. Its bones, bleached gray by seasons of sun and sorrow, held together with the tenacity of things too stubborn to die. The land around it was wide and open, but the walls inside seemed to close tighter with each passing day, shrinking into themselves like a mouth swallowing its own tongue. Inside, Hester Langley moved through her days with mechanical resolve. Her hands, veined and practiced, folded linen, scrubbed counters, stirred pots of thin stew. She did not speak to herself, nor to anyone else unless required. There was a rhythm to her silence, a purpose in her control. She had learned long ago that grief could be domesticated if you kept your routines sharp enough. Grief, after all, had tried to drown her once. She had fought back with vinegar and rules. She rarely looked toward the cellar door now. She didn't need to. She trusted the lock, trusted the thickness of wood and the silence below it. Marian's sounds had grown quieter over time, more infrequent. That was how it always happened. People adjusted to darkness if you gave them long enough. Even birds forget to sing when the sky is taken from them. Marian did not forget. She clung to memory like a root in dry soil, desperate for water. Her body had grown weaker, and the ache in her spine became a constant companion, but her mind remained sharp. She remembered the taste of cinnamon tea, the sound of Eli's boots at the door, The softness in his voice when he read her lines from his worn poetry book. The way he had looked at her, not with hunger, not with expectation, but with deep, steady awe, like she was something sacred he didn't quite understand. That memory lived louder than her captor's footsteps. The cellar had become a world of small rituals. Marian counted cracks in the ceiling, rearranged the stones around her to spell imaginary names, whispered lullabies to her unborn child with a breathy tenderness that made the shadows feel like family. She rationed the crusts Hester gave her, chewing them slow, letting them soften on her tongue before swallowing. Hunger gnawed at her but didn't define her. What defined her was the will not to disappear. She had stopped expecting kindness from above. But kindness came anyway, one afternoon, as a voice. A creak. A rustle. Then a whisper, carried through the floorboards, so faint she thought it might be her imagination. Hello. Marian froze. The word felt like light. Her fingers tightened around the ragged shawl covering her shoulders. Is someone down there? The voice came again, small, unsure, but alive. She moved toward the source of the sound, pressing her mouth against the seam where two planks didn't quite meet. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I'm here. A gasp from above. Then silence. Then the whisper again. Who are you? My name is Marian, she said, each syllable cracking from disuse. I live here, or I did. There was a pause, then the sound of a child's voice, softer now, close to the floor as if the speaker had knelt. My name's Lila. My family's farm is west of here. I bring milk to the lady upstairs sometimes. Marian felt her breath catch. A child. Of course. That explained the voice, the innocence wrapped in its tone like ribbon. Can you help me, Lila? She asked. A long pause. Then, she said you left. That you went east to have your baby with your sister. I never left, Marian whispered. She locked me down here. More silence. The kind that builds behind young eyes trying to understand cruelty they've never had to carry. I have to go, Lila whispered at last. But I'll come back. I promise. And she did. The next day, and the one after that. She came when Hester was out back tending her bitter little garden, or in town trading dried lavender for lamp oil. Lila would kneel beside the house, her voice slipping between cracks like morning light. She told Marian about her brothers, who threw stones at tree trunks for fun. About her mother's singing voice. About a calf born last week with a crooked leg and a sweet nature. And Marian, in return, gave stories, soft, wide ones about rivers and wildflowers and love that waited in silence. She never told Lila everything. The girl was too young to carry the full weight. But in their shared whispering, Marian felt something return to her, not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. Above, Hester began to notice the missing milk. She asked fewer questions than most women might. Suspicion flickered in her like a dying candle but never fully ignited. She assumed Lila was a greedy child or that some wild cat had made off with the jar. She did not know that beneath her feet, Marian had begun to smile again. Still, each day brought more urgency. The baby was coming. Marian could feel it in the pressure in her hips, in the way her body pulsed like a clock winding down. She had no idea what day it was. She marked time by movement, the baby's, her own, the sounds overhead. She could feel herself nearing a breaking point. The light Lila brought wasn't enough to carry her through birth in a dark cellar. I need help, she whispered one evening, her breath trembling against the boards. Lila sounded older that day. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was something else. I know. I'm thinking of someone who might listen. Don't tell Hester. I won't. Marian pressed her hand to the floor above her, palm open, as if offering trust. From the other side, there was no touch. But she heard Lila's breath hitch, and that was enough. Hester remained unaware, walking the house in her iron-gray silence, folding napkins that no one used, boiling tea no one drank. She hummed sometimes, a tuneless thing, neither melody nor memory. Her world was orderly, her lies seamless. The neighbors didn't visit much. Hester had a way of making people feel unwelcome without saying a word. She liked it that way. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. She had not always been like this. There had been a time when Hester believed in softness. But softness had betrayed her. First in the form of a daughter who coughed herself into the grave. Then in a husband who drank away the last of their savings. She had grown tired of waiting for the world to be fair. Marian had reminded her too much of that forgotten tenderness. Of a version of herself that had once loved poetry and flowers. That weakness, she'd told herself, had no place in this house anymore. But even walls reinforced with bitterness can't keep out what's meant to bloom. That evening, after Lila's footsteps faded into the distance, Marian laid back and placed both hands on her stomach. The child within her shifted, not in pain, not in protest, but in rhythm, as if listening. She sang then, soft and low, a lullaby her own mother used to hum. The notes were cracked and quiet, but they filled the space like candlelight. In that moment, the cellar didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a womb, a place of beginning. The wind outside softened. The stars, unseen, blinked into being one by one. Upstairs, Hester lit a single lamp, the flame flickering uncertainly. In the space between the floorboards, dust floated, and time held its breath. Marian didn't know if help would come, but she knew she had been heard. She knew her voice had not disappeared. And sometimes, that was enough to keep breathing one more night. Far east of the Langley homestead, past the gray plateaus and the canyons that swallowed the sun, a man rode beneath a sky stitched with clouds. His coat hung loose over his frame, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and his face bore the kind of quiet that only survivors carry, not joyless, but stripped of illusions. His name was Eli Langley, and he had been to hell and back in blue uniform, then lost to paper and ink by a clerk who mistook a breathing man for a buried one. The bullet that should have ended him had not. It tore clean through his side during a charge at Gettysburg, left him bleeding beside a field of crushed violets and shattered limbs. A farmhand named Cyrus dragged him from the pile and nursed him in a forgotten loft, where his fever fought for weeks against the pull of death. When Eli finally stood again, the war had shifted elsewhere and the world had moved on. He had not died, but news of his survival never outran the death notice stamped with a wax seal and sent westward. 4 weeks, he remained in Pennsylvania, watching seasons change from a borrowed window, trying to rebuild muscle and purpose. Each night he wrote to Marian, his fingers trembling not from fear but from want, the want of her voice, her hands, her calm. He told her everything, the things he'd seen, the faces he could no longer forget, the guilt that clung like damp wool. But he never mailed the letters. Something inside him, pride, perhaps, or shame, convinced him she had moved on. A young widow, beautiful and kind, with family out east who might have taken her in. He imagined her beginning again, hair braided, belly round, surrounded by softness. He didn't want to haunt her doorstep like a ghost risen too late. Still, he kept the letters. Folded and refolded. Some were stained from the rain, others from the ink that bled when his hands shook too hard. He read them to himself when the silence grew too long. Then one morning, as spring crept in with its green fingers and birds returned to perch on wire fences, he made up his mind to go home, not as a soldier, but as a man. Home was still far away, but each mile he traveled felt like shedding a layer of doubt. The closer he came, the more the memory of Marian rose in him. Her laughter in the morning, the way she cradled books as if they were kittens, the way she had whispered his name like it was made of honey and hope. Marian, meanwhile, was counting time in heartbeats. The child stirred beneath her ribs more often now. It wasn't kicking, it was shifting, moving with slow intention, like it knew the walls of the cellar were not wide enough to meet the world. Her own body ached under the weight of both pregnancy and despair, but her voice remained steady. Each day, she spoke aloud to the baby, reciting bits of poetry, lines from memory, even fragments of Eli's old letters. She had only a few of them now, the one she had carried in the pocket of her apron the day Hester closed the cellar door. The ink had faded, but the words still hummed with life. "My dearest Marian," she whispered one evening, tracing the letters with her fingertip, "I saw a red bird today, and for a moment I thought of you in that faded dress with the blue flowers. You were laughing. I could hear it, even though I was so far away." She closed her eyes. "I could hear it." Lila returned as often as she could. The girl was quiet by nature, But something about Marian's voice made her bolder, like she was carrying a secret treasure and knew its worth. She began bringing scraps, half a biscuit, a piece of cheese, a strip of cloth soaked in cool well water. Each offering was given without expectation. Marian received them with trembling gratitude. "I told my brother I saw a fox," Lila whispered once. "That's why I come over here. He doesn't ask much. He's busy fixing the roof." "You're very clever," Marian said, and meant it. "Foxes are clever too." Lila smiled. Her eyes had grown older in the past few weeks. Not dimmer, just more alert. She watched the world differently now. She had seen what others had missed. One afternoon, Lila crouched beside the cellar vent, her hands dusty from crawling under the porch. "Marian," she whispered, "do you think your husband is really dead?" Marian hesitated. Then, softly, "I used to believe it. But lately, I don't know. Some days, I feel him nearby. Not like a ghost. Like a breath. Like something unfinished." Lila leaned closer, as if holding her breath might keep the moment from fading. "If I could find someone," the girl asked, "someone who could help, would you want me to?" "Yes," Marian said, the word like a flame. "Yes, I would." Lila nodded, then vanished like a shadow sliding off a wall. In the distance, Eli crossed into Kansas, his boots worn thin, his horse lamed from a stumble near the river. He walked beside it now, tugging gently on the reins, muttering encouragement. He carried only a small satchel, and inside it, the stack of letters never sent. The thought of Marian reading them one day both terrified and comforted him. He wondered if she had waited, if she had remarried, if she would look at him with pity or anger, or, somehow, with love. He arrived in the nearby town of Hayesville 2 days later. Dust clung to his coat, and his eyes were sun-cracked, but the name Langley still opened doors. A shopkeeper remembered Hester. A blacksmith mentioned seeing her in town just last week, trading a jar of gooseberry jam for nails. "No sign of the young missus, though," he said, wiping soot from his brow. "Folks said she left after you passed. Shame that. She was gentle." Eli didn't speak, just nodded and turned toward the plains, his pulse pounding harder than it had on any battlefield. That night, he camped under an old cottonwood, laying on his back with the letters beside him. He pulled one out and began to read aloud. His voice was raspy, but steady. "I don't know how to explain what I've seen," he said to the stars. "Men turning into bones beside me. Smoke that never clears. But I do know what brought me back. It was your face, Marian. The thought of holding it in my hands again. That's what kept me walking." Somewhere, as if by unseen tether, Marian awoke in the cellar, her hand pressed to her heart. She dreamed of water. Not the cruel kind that drowns, but the kind that kisses dry earth. She dreamed of a door swinging open, of light pouring in. Lila had not returned in 2 days, and the silence left a hole in Marian's chest. She feared the girl had been found out, that Hester had caught her listening too close. The older woman had grown sharper lately, her movements more tense, her eyes scanning corners like she expected something to unravel. But Marian held on, even when her lips cracked, even when the hunger twisted. She held on. Eli was coming. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it in her bones. And the baby, as if sensing it too, kicked once, then twice, a firm rhythm, steady as a promise. Outside, far beyond the reach of the cellar's walls, the sun crept higher over the horizon. Dust lifted from the earth in lazy swirls. A single figure on foot moved slowly across the plain, eyes fixed on a house that had once held everything dear. His hand brushed the letters in his coat. And somewhere deep beneath that house, Marian whispered one last line to the child who had waited so patiently to be born. "He's coming," she said. "I feel it." And the wind, gentle and sure, seemed to answer, as if it too had been waiting for the story to unfold. The prairie stretched quiet and flat beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, the kind of sky that held its breath before a storm. A soft breeze carried the scent of old earth and dry wheat, whispering through the cracks of the Langley house like a voice trying to be heard. The shingles rattled against the wind's fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once, then fell silent. Eli Langley stood 100 paces from the place he used to call home. The house looked smaller than memory had painted it, more hunched, more weathered, like it, too, had aged in his absence. His eyes tracked every inch, the sag in the porch rail, the missing shutter on the second floor, the soot stain above the chimney he'd once cleaned with his own hands. But it was the stillness that struck him hardest. There was no music in the windchime Marion had hung from the eaves. No smoke curling from the stovepipe. Just quiet, thick and watchful. He tied the reins of his horse to the broken fence post and stepped onto the porch with the caution of a man approaching a grave. The door creaked open before he could knock. Hester stood in the doorway, dressed in black like always, her spine straight and chin set. For a heartbeat, she looked at him as if seeing a ghost, her face paling beneath the lines that time had etched like frost. "Eli," she said, not as welcome, but as fact. He removed his hat slowly, his voice dry from road dust. "I got home as soon as I could." Her mouth twitched, something bitter behind the eyes. "You're late." "I know," he said. "Where's Marion?" A pause. Not long, but just long enough. "She left," Hester answered, each word wrapped in ice. "Months ago. After the telegram came. Said she couldn't stay. Took her troubles east." He stared at her, the words drifting toward him like ash. "She left. She wasn't fit to stay here alone. Not in her state. I suppose she had her reasons." His eyes narrowed, something old and sharp waking in him. "Did she leave any note? Any word?" "She said her goodbyes," Hester replied too quickly, her hands tightening on the edge of the door. "There's no use stirring it up again. It's done." But Eli had learned in war how to read the things men tried to hide. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flinched toward the floor and then away again. He stepped past her without asking permission. Inside, the air was thick with dried herbs and something fainter, something wrong. He glanced around. The parlor was neat, too neat. Every book aligned, every surface scrubbed. But the hearth was cold, and a layer of dust coated the top of the rocking chair Marion used to sit in. Her embroidery basket was gone. So was her coat. But a scarf remained. Torn, faded, blue with embroidered daisies. He picked it up from the corner of the stove, where it had been stuffed halfway into the kindling bin. The threads were scorched at one end. He rubbed the fabric between his fingers, his throat tightening. This was hers. "She must have forgotten it," Hester said from behind him. "She wouldn't forget this." His voice cracked, not from doubt, but certainty. "She made it while I was away. She wore it every day." Silence stood between them like a blade. "Where is she, Hester?" Her lips pressed together in a line that once held him's but now held only contempt. "She was too soft, Eli. She needed someone to make choices for her. I did what had to be done." His blood turned cold. The floor beneath his feet gave a soft creak, and his ears strained. There it was again, a noise. Faint. A sound no louder than a breath beneath the floorboards. Not wind. Not house settling. A voice. He dropped the scarf and moved toward the kitchen, heart pounding in his chest. The cellar door stood shut, bolted from the outside. He turned the latch. "No." Hester's voice broke open like thunder behind him. "Don't you open that door." But he already had. The darkness inside smelled of earth and time. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended, calling softly, "Marion!" No answer. He reached the bottom and paused, eyes adjusting. Then, movement. A flicker. And there, curled in the corner like the last ember of a dying fire, was the woman he had not stopped dreaming of. She looked up at him, and for a long moment, the world stopped breathing. Her face was thinner, drawn. Her hands trembled where they clutched her belly. But her eyes, those eyes, still held the blue of twilight, and the moment they met his, they filled with water, not of sorrow but of belief. "Eli," she whispered, voice ragged and small. He crossed the space between them like a man possessed, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering before they touched her cheeks, her hair, her trembling fingers. "I thought I lost you," she murmured. "You never did," he breathed. Above them, footsteps pounded. A door slammed. But down here, time curled inward like a secret kept too long. "I knew you weren't dead," she said, trying to sit upright, but he steadied her gently. "You held on," he said. "You saved our child. I didn't do it alone." She glanced toward the small vent at the ceiling. "There's a girl, Lila. She brought food. She listened." He nodded, gripping her hand. "We'll thank her together. When you're safe." She leaned into him, the weight of months dissolving in the curve of his arms. For the first time in so long, her breath came without fear. He carried her up the stairs, one arm beneath her knees, the other around her back. Her hair brushed his chin, and he inhaled the scent of dust and lavender. Hester stood in the parlor, face tight with disbelief and fury. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "She would have ruined you. She already has." But Eli didn't answer. He turned and stepped out the door, the wind wrapping around them like a shield. Behind him, the house groaned as if it knew the truth had been let loose, and it would never rest easy again. He laid Marion gently in the wagon he had borrowed from town and wrapped her in a blanket. Her head rested against his chest as they began the slow ride back. No words were needed. They had survived. From the brush, a small figure stepped into view, Lila, watching with wide eyes. Eli nodded to her, and the girl ran forward, slipping her hand into Marion's, silent as always, steady as ever. As the wagon rolled away, the house behind them shrank, swallowed by horizon and dusk. And though the land was dry, something in it felt ready to bloom. Eli looked at the woman beside him, the child within her stirring again. "I remembered your eyes," he whispered. Marion smiled through her tears. "That's all I needed." The sun rose slow the next morning, painting the land with the soft amber of things trying to begin again. The wind, for once, was quiet. It carried no warnings, no cold whispers through the grass, only the scent of dew and dust and something sweeter lingering just beneath the surface, as if the earth itself were relieved to finally exhale. Eli Langley stood at the edge of the porch of the old mining shack where he and Marion had taken shelter the night before. His hands were calloused and still stained with yesterday's dirt, but they no longer shook. In the cradle of his arms, he held a hammer and a strip of linen soaked in warm water. Behind him, through the open door, Marion lay resting on the cot he had made from cedar planks and old wool blankets. Her face was pale but not hollow anymore. Exhaustion clung to her like smoke, but so did life. Her belly, once heavy with silence and fear, now lay slack, and in her arms, wrapped in a faded shawl, slept a girl no bigger than a loaf of bread. The child had come swift and wild in the early hours, just as thunder began to whisper along the far ridgeline, as if nature itself had been waiting for the moment. Hope. That was the name Marion whispered with cracked lips and wet lashes when she first held her. Eli had only nodded, too full to speak. There was something sacred in the name, as if it reached backward and forward at once, stitching together what had been torn. Eli didn't believe in much anymore. Not the kind of faith his mother had once tried to tuck into his collar. But when he looked at them now, the world felt less like something to endure and more like something to tend. He stepped outside into the golden hush and began nailing the last board across the broken window of the shack. It wasn't a home yet, but it would be. He was still working when he heard the slow approach of hooves. 3 riders came up the slope, their silhouettes tall and narrow against the light. The lead wore a deputy's badge, his coat dusted with travel. Behind him rode Lila's older brother, Elijah, and Sheriff Kincaid, a man known more for his quiet justice than his speed with a gun. Eli straightened, wiping his palms against his trousers as they dismounted. "You Langley?" the sheriff asked, voice low and even. "I am." "We heard some things." His gaze drifted past Eli, toward the doorway, where Marion now stood, holding the infant in her arms. Her posture was upright, but her eyes were guarded, the kind of gaze a woman carries after months of watching everything be taken from her. She said nothing, but the sheriff removed his hat. "I'd like to hear your side if you're ready," he said gently. Eli nodded, stepping aside so they could enter. Marion sat down slowly, shifting the baby into the crook of her elbow. Lila's brother remained near the wall, arms crossed tight, eyes darting like a boy trying to understand too many adult things at once. The sheriff, on the other hand, listened without interruption as Eli and Marion spoke. First one, then the other, each word heavy but sure. They told it all: the telegram, the basement, the days without light, the girl who brought food and hope. Marion's voice didn't crack until she mentioned the way Hester had stopped bringing water near the end. Eli's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her reclaim her voice. The baby slept through it, mouth twitching now and then like she was already dreaming of something better. When they finished, the room was quiet. Outside, a hawk screamed across the open sky, circling once before vanishing. "She's still in the house?" the sheriff asked. Eli nodded. "She hasn't left since," Marion added. "I think she believed no one would come." The sheriff sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "Some people think silence is a kind of power. But truth catches up, one way or another." He turned to leave, then paused. "We'll need you both to give a full account in town. Not just for justice. For clarity. Rumors move fast." "We'll be there," Eli said. The men left as slowly as they came, their dust hanging in the air long after the hooves faded. Eli returned to Marion's side. She reached for his hand, their fingers tangling in the quiet. Later that afternoon, they took the wagon back to the Langley house. It stood unchanged, as if the sun had forgotten to warm its walls. The garden was dry, the porch broom still leaning against the doorframe. A lone crow sat on the roof, watching. Sheriff Kincaid approached first, his badge glinting in the light. He knocked once, firm and without hesitation. When the door creaked open, Hester stood there, shoulders straight, lips pressed into that same pale line. "I heard you coming," she said. "We're here to speak on behalf of Marion Langley," the sheriff replied. "And on account of confinement without law or warrant." Hester didn't flinch. She wasn't right. Not after he died. She needed watching. "Is that what you call it?" Eli asked from behind the sheriff, stepping into view. "She needed love. She needed support. You locked her in the dark like she was nothing." "She was weak," Hester snapped. "She cried every night for weeks. She would have lost the child if I hadn't." "She didn't lose the child," Marion said, voice rising behind them. "She survived despite you." Hester looked toward her, and for a second, a brief, flickering second, something cracked in her eyes. Not remorse, perhaps, but recognition. A memory of her own daughter. The one who had died in winter, who had wept quietly in her fever, whom Hester had tried and failed to save. But the moment passed. "You have no idea what I've given to this land," Hester whispered. "What I've buried to keep this family name from shame." "Names don't mean anything when you bury people with them," Marion replied. The sheriff stepped between them. "You'll come with us. There'll be a hearing." Hester didn't resist. She stepped forward, hands folded, eyes ahead. She passed Marion without looking, but her fingers twitched slightly as she walked by the child wrapped in her arms, a glance of something buried so deep it couldn't quite bloom. The house emptied. The echo of footsteps faded. Marion stood still for a long time before walking inside. The air was thinner now. Not pure, not yet, but lighter, like windows had been opened in rooms long closed. Eli walked with her, taking slow steps through the house. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Every doorway they passed was a reminder. Every beam, every stair, a monument to what they had come through. That night, they didn't return to the shack. They stayed. The house was no longer Hester's. Eli pulled out the old letters, the ones he had never sent, and burned them in the hearth, one by one. Not in anger, but in ceremony. The words had served their purpose. They had carried him through the miles. But now Marion was here, and she deserved new words. They slept together in the parlor, the baby between them, firelight casting slow shadows on the walls. The weeks that followed were quiet, but not still. Neighbors returned. Some brought food. Others brought apologies, none owed, but freely given. Lila came often, her hair in braids, her eyes bright. Marion gave her the scarf Hester had tried to burn, and Lila wore it like a badge. The trial was brief. Hester didn't protest the charges. She answered questions in clipped phrases, neither pleading for mercy nor denying the truth. When the verdict came, 6 months at the county house with mandatory care and observation, she nodded once and said, "That's fair." She never returned to the Langley homestead. Marion and Eli planted sunflowers that spring. They tore down the cellar door and replaced it with open stairs. Marion lined the walls with shelves, filled them with jars and books and blankets. It became a nursery, a place of warmth. Hope grew fast. She cried loud and laughed louder. Her hair came in dark, her eyes pale, a storm and a sky all at once. And one summer night, when the stars hung low and warm in the velvet sky, Marion rocked her daughter on the porch and whispered, "You came from the dark, but you were never born of it." Eli leaned against the post, his eyes on the horizon. The wind played through the grass, gentle and full. He looked at Marion and spoke as if to her soul. "You saved yourself, you know." She smiled. "No, I was seen. And that was enough." And somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, not mournful, not lonely, but strong. A sound of passage, of forward motion, of time choosing to move forward. The dust had settled, and the truth stood.